Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our next session. So our next panel will be on green finance and innovation for industry. So we'll be talking about what opportunities exist for technology innovators and investors to partner to deliver the industrial sector of the future. So we've got a great lineup today of speakers. We'll be hearing from Gresham House, from the Carbon Trust, Breakthrough Energy Europe, and the Centre for Nature and Climate at the World Economic Forum. So a real esteemed list of speakers there. I'd like to start by introducing our moderator for the session today. So Kate Levick is our moderator for the session. She's an Associate Director for Sustainable Finance at E3G. She leads E3G's activities on sustainable finance. She's the co-chair of the Secretariat of the UK's Transition Plan Task Force. She's been involved in the UNFCCC and has had various roles in government and also a career at BP before now. So I'd like to welcome the panelists on stage and our moderator, Kate, for the session. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's great to see so much interest in the room, and also a few familiar faces and lots of new faces. So I hope we'll have a really interesting and stimulating discussion today. The UK is focused on increasing ambition and accelerating the green industrial revolution. And at every point in the life cycle, opportunities exist for technology innovators and investors to partner to deliver the industrial sectors of the future. And investments not only in infrastructure, but also in supercharging R&D and workforce skills is what will be needed to give the UK that competitive edge. So we've got a great panel today that we're going to hear from, and I hope they'll really help address this policy context. We'll talk both about the need to transition existing industrial activities, which is certainly something we look at a lot in the Transition Plan Task Force that I'm involved in, but also about the need for innovation and to grow these new sectors and how to bring on new technologies and new activities. So I'd like to briefly introduce the panel. You can see them all listed up on the screen there. We've got Peter Bachmann, the Managing Director for Sustainable Infrastructure at Gresham House, David Aiken, who's the Director of Innovation at the Carbon Trust, Julia Reynaud, the Senior Director for Breakthrough Energy Europe, and last but not least, Nathan Cooper, who has many hats actually, but I'm going to sort of summarize it all by saying he's very much working in this field across a range of activities at the World Economic Forum, and I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about that during the session. So we have a big challenge ahead. The conference at COP27 last year, and Nick Stern and Vera Songray and Amar Bhattacharya released a big report about what was required to finance the global climate transition. They said by 2030, we're going to need $1 trillion per year as investment going into emerging markets and developing economies. There are a lot of big statistics that we throw around, but I'm just thought I'd throw that one with its very high number of zeros just to remind us of the scale of the challenge that's involved. So when we're talking about sometimes relatively small but strategically crucial investments into innovation, these are things that we expect to scale to, in some cases, almost an unimaginable degree over the next few decades so that we can meet the climate challenge. So, having set the scene a little bit, I'm going to start off by asking our panel some questions, and I'll start with David. So, David, I'll start with Peter, because I'm looking in the wrong order. So, Peter, can you give us some specific examples of real solutions that are being developed today which might become the mainstream industries of the future? And I'm also interested to hear whether you think the UK can retain an industrial and manufacturing base, given all the international competition that we're seeing right now, including the pressures created by the US IRA.
Yeah, so I think firstly, your stat of 1 trillion, I think, is vastly understating how much is really needed. I think various people will say it's 10, 20, 100 trillion is needed, so it's really, really big. I guess I'm quite keen on focusing on real-world solutions, so I'll talk to you about a couple of those. One example, for example, is there's a huge steel and cement industry out there. They're probably the two most polluting industries on the planet that we have, and probably the two ones that have got the most challenges. And actually, the session before was about hydrogen, which is potentially trying to decarbonize certainly the steel sector. What we've done is we've built a plant up in Middlesbrough, you can come and have a look at it, where we take 300,000 tonnes of commercial and industrial waste that would otherwise go to landfill, and we turn that into a pellet, and that pellet can directly replace coal. And that coal is used in the cement and steel industries in their blast furnaces to create those products. That single plant in Middlesbrough can produce about 800,000 tonnes of CO2 savings a year in terms of avoided carbon. 800,000 tonnes. That's 500,000 plus of cars off the road. So that's just one plant, and that's one very practical example of decarbonising potentially the cement and steel industries. Another one that I think about a lot is food. So food is an area that is a huge, big polluter, particularly in terms of land use. I mean, if you look at the amount of land that we use just to feed the animals that we then feed off, it's huge. One stat I always think about is if you look at all the cows on the planet, they consume about 8.7 billion people's worth of calories every year. 8.7 billion. So that's more than what the people consume just for the cows that we consume. So, that starts to give you some of the land use issues that we've got. So the way that we think about it is we're doing some things around vertical farming. So if you don't know what vertical farming, that's growing in essentially a controlled environment where we have LED lights, you have hydroponics where you recirculate the water, and it allows us to use land about 250 to 500 times more efficiently. We use 98% less water, no chemicals and pesticides. And then the really cool things is, for the people in the UK, you'll have seen some salad bag shortages. There's some really big supply problems because of climate change, and we can produce food 365 days of the year. And then the final bit is because of the way that we grow and that we harvest, our product lasts 14 to 21 days longer. So that means a lot better in terms of food waste, really big impact on you because you've probably had those salad bags that go off after a couple of days. But then it's really big in terms of plastic packaging. Plastic packaging is causing things like microplastics. Microplastics is causing big problems in terms of fertility. So you kind of look at that as a full loop, and that actually tackling food in the right way can really tackle some bigger long-term problems. And then boil that down into carbon. This is about 1,900 times better from a carbon perspective compared to imported field-grown crops. So it helps sustainability, it helps carbon, it's really all-encompassing. And they're two practical examples, I guess, of how I think innovation can really drive some of these solutions to these big problems. You also asked about what we need to continue to do that. It's access to green energy. So if you look at our vertical farming business, we pay about 27p per kilowatt hour for power. We're looking at projects in Canada right now where we can get 100% renewables because they've got all green hydro power near Montreal, and we're going to pay 3p. 3p compared to 27p. It's massive power difference, and it's green. And what that allows us to do is we're currently growing leafy greens, and leafy greens aren't going to solve the world's problems. But when we can get power at 3p, we can grow soy, wheat, and rice. Soy, wheat, and rice is then going to allow us to replace those cows that are consuming a lot of land and creating a lot of GHG. So, if I had to think about one policy thing, it's definitely access to green power. And the UK needs to be doing things to make the grid more accessible. When we look at projects now in the UK, grid availability is the single biggest challenge that we have. We've got projects that we thought would be able to get grid connections very soon. They're now being pushed out to 2027 or 2030, and that's inhibiting us from doing a lot of things. And that's fundamentally a policy level decision as well, in the way that the government needs to incentivize people to fundamentally allocate more capital into scaling up the grid. Very quick answers. I won't keep going on because I know that the panel have a lot, but I could keep going on as much as you want about other things.
No, thank you very much. That's given us a great start. So I will now turn to David. And, David, a major system transformation needs to take place. What is the role of existing industry in this transition, particularly in the UK, versus some of the disruptive new industries that Peter's been telling us about?
Thank you. Well, I think one of the things that's helpful framing around industry is, often it's people thinking, it's all about, heavy industry, steel, cement, chemicals, these sort of things, which is really important, as Peter was saying. But industry is really diverse. It's also picking up things like, agriculture and food system elements. It's picking up mining, ICT, wastewater processing, these sorts of things. And so for the UK to think about where it's competitive, and what that means on an international stage, a really important piece is, what does the UK's role look like across this diversity of industry, and what are the innovations that can come through that can help to save energy, carbon, and costs at home, and create export opportunities overseas. And in each of these areas, there are existing industries in the UK that are looking to decarbonize, and innovators looking to break into these industries with new solutions that help us to do things better, faster, cheaper. It's not easy, though. When we think about changing industrial processes, that's risky. That is something that has high stakes for not only the industrial manufacturers themselves, but for the customers that they sell to. And so when we think about how the UK can make a difference on transitioning some of these existing industries, there's a really important role for showcasing some of these new solutions to help transition the existing industries to what the future can look like. But it's not just about showcasing, it's also a range of other challenges. And one of the things that we do with our Industrial Energy Efficiency Accelerator is really try and pull together some of the different elements that need to happen as part of that industrial transition in these existing industries to show what's possible and to showcase what some of these new innovations can deliver. So just to give you a sense, over the course of that work, over more than 30 projects across 4 rounds, we've seen innovative technologies come through that can really make a big difference at scale in the UK and abroad. To give you a sense of scale, if we had industry-wide adoption of the technologies that we've demonstrated on the first 2 rounds of that accelerator initiative, we'd be looking at around 40 terawatt hours of energy savings out to 2031 and around 10 megatons of CO2e savings. So there's real potential for some of these new innovations to come through and make a big difference in the UK. And that can make a real shift in how some of the industrial operators and these new innovators are able to act. So to give you an example, just to bring it to life, we've worked with a company called LAT Water. They have an innovative treatment and separation technology for landfill leachate. And their solution is able to reduce the energy used as part of that landfill leachate treatment by almost 50%. And to do that through using low-grade waste heat and renewable energy and deliver 0 emissions to air and water. And for those that don't spend their spare time walking around landfill sites and think, why does leachate matter? Well, for many of these leachate challenges for these landfill sites across the UK, it's more than 50% of the operating costs of these landfill sites. And companies like Viridor are looking for solutions that can address their big cost, carbon, and emission drivers. And so the types of solutions that LAT Water are delivering for the types of customers like Viridor are making a big difference to energy, to emissions, to costs, and they have huge potential to transition industries in the UK and abroad.
Great, thank you, David. So I'm going to move now to Julia. So working at Breakthrough Energy, Julia is obviously involved, just like Carbon Trust, in really trying to work with innovators. And Julia, I'd be interested to hear more about your work with innovators at all stages of the innovation process, particularly in the UK context. We often hear, concerns about how early stage innovation will be funded. Is that the key concern? Are there other factors also to take into account?
Thank you so much, Kate, and good morning, everyone. So let me just say, the size of the challenge is huge. We need to go from 51 gigatons to 0 by 2050. And so we're talking about another 1 investment cycle away from where we need to go. Now, to the question around sort of what we're doing at Breakthrough, we're simply say we're trying to go from making green incredibly cheaper than brown. And so what Bill Gates calls the green premium, this is essentially what we're trying to address. Now, very much following the IEA's analysis, we've got a team of scientists, of technologists that are looking at, well, what technologies do we need in order to reach net zero? And we know that they're not at the same level of stage of maturity. Some are still in the labs, thinking about sort of breakthroughs in how you make steel and how you make cement. or some are much more towards commercial scale, ready to be commercialized, but still have some of those challenges. So thinking of the UK context, how do we bring sort of the offshore wind success story or the solar success story to many more other industries in a much faster way? So if you were to look at breakthrough energy, you can look at it in terms of capital, technology, and policy, and partnerships. Those are the 4 things on which we work. Specifically focusing on capital, and the capital that we provide as an organization, we have 3 types of platforms. And so they all seek to address what is a valley of death as you're thinking about going from lab to market. The first program we have is called Fellows, and this is providing grants essentially to first-generation entrepreneurs. So graduates that are just out of university, had their PhD, but want to set up have a few more technology milestones to go. And what we're doing is providing them with grant funding and matching them with business mentors who can help them think through what about their IP strategy, what about their commercial strategy, what about partnerships that they need. In the UK, we've got several fellows, and one of them is a company called Aikido that's helping to reduce the cost of floating offshore wind by 20 to 30%. Here, grant capital is really important because this isn't the type of sort of company that can scale where you can already, it's not ready for venture. And that brings me to the second type of funding that we provide that helps to solve for the funding gap at the equity stage, where these entrepreneurs are actually looking to raise more funds to actually build those companies to be able to hire the teams. And here, what we've been doing is providing in the form of patient capital, flexible capital that allows for the types of deep tech cycles that we're looking at. These technologies are not like digital. They won't be developed in 1 or 2 years. Steel is really hard. You need a number of milestones. So this is where, through the fund that we have, we've got 2 companies in the UK, but the overall portfolio is about 110 companies. One of them is Reactive Technologies that looks at grid inertia, and another one is working called Mission Zero Technology that works on direct air capture. But then once you sort of have these companies that are ready to scale, there's another big challenge, the valley of death around first-of-a-kind project financing. There still is a lot of tech risk associated. There's a feedstock risk, there's a construction risk, there's a price risk, and you need that type of tailored funding. It's not just about the amount of funding, is what risk appetite does that funding have, and how can it overcome some of the challenges related, for example, to those premiums. So we, with a number of corporates and philanthropists, we set up another program called Catalyst, which is essentially tailoring to the types of funding needs that those first-of-a-kind projects have. And here again, we have a partnership with the UK government in trying to see how we can align that type of funding for projects based in the UK, looking at green hydrogen or clean hydrogen, long-duration energy storage, sustainable aviation fuels, green steel, green cement, and a few other technologies like direct air capture. But I'd say that's sort of what we provide in terms of capital. But I'm part of the team that's focused more on philanthropy and policy. And that brings me to sort of something that we've done in the UK, which is called Clean Tech for UK, that was launched with the Prime Minister and Bill Gates a few months ago, where essentially we need to hear more of that voice from next generation entrepreneurs, next generation technologists, but also those who invest. Those like Peter, those who are more on the venture side, and to hear some of the challenges that they're seeing and that they're dealing with when it comes to policy, regulation, permitting, all of those issues. So in a number of countries, including through Clean Tech for UK, we've tried to help build that bridge of dialogue between what are the entrepreneurs, the venture funds seeing, and how can that translate. So we are working quite a lot in the UK, but certainly working with also partners like the Carbon Trust.
Fantastic, thank you. And now coming to Nathan. Nathan, we've talked about sort of different types of investor action, I guess. It would be interesting to hear from you on what government can do, and not only in terms of policy, but also in terms of creating demand signals that will drive innovation, for example, through public procurement.
Amazing, thank you so much. And I'm super excited about all of the kind of ground solutions that we're hearing today. I think it's been said a lot, but we are really in a decisive decade. I think the decisions that all of us in the room take today and over the next 7 years or so will define the future of civilization. So no mean feat. One of the first things I wanted to say, and it's been talked about for kind of 3 decades now, but there's a basic market imperfection when it comes to polluting, and the cost of pollution to the economy still isn't integrated into the economic decisions that we make today. We know there's some estimates that climate change will likely reduce global GDP by 15% by 2050 if we don't act now. And just to put that in context, the COVID kind of initial lockdown reduced global GDP by about 3% as well. So you can see the magnitude that we're talking here. So I think a robust price on carbon is very important. Across the globe, there's around 70 global carbon pricing initiatives. But actually, it's only 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions that are actually covered by the type of price that we need to see, which is between 50 and around 75 US dollars per ton as well. And carbon pricing doesn't have to come at a cost to the poorest people. It can be progressive as well. And actually the benefits from, or the kind of resources that you generate from carbon pricing can actually be used for redistribution to ensure kind of equitable redistribution across societies. So that was just the first point that I wanted to make. And then the second point, you mentioned the importance of demand, particularly the role of governments as well. So when, as Julie was mentioning, when we normally think about the kind of innovation curve, we think through the technology going through various cycles, and each cycle is supported by usually concessionary finance, grant funding from innovation agencies such as Innovate UK and across the world. But as Julia mentioned as well, there's a valley of death when we go from the products there, but it's not at commercial scale. And particularly across the hard to abate sectors where we need significant amounts of transformational low carbon technologies, a lot of those technologies aren't at commercial scale yet. So something that actually we were discussing earlier is the power of demand-led innovation, which is how we get the public, governments, but also the private sector actually setting a very clear demand signal to buy up these transformational low-carbon technologies. I think that's very exciting, and actually something that was announced a couple of days ago, which is very exciting. Two members of the First Movers Coalition, Holcim, one of the largest concrete cement producers in the world, and Volvo Trucks as well, just committed to procuring 1,000 electric trucks, which is very exciting and exactly what we need to do. So I think companies have a key role to play by committing, telling the market that they're ready to buy up these transformational technologies, but then governments can play a critical role as well. Innovate UK is really excited about this as well, and we're actually talking about how we look at innovation, demand-led innovation within the context of the UK. One of the specific things that governments can do, not only at the federal level, but also at the subnational and cities level, is to leverage the power of their procurement. So federal governments, subnational governments often are the biggest procurers of things like concrete and steel for their facilities, infrastructure, roads, buildings, etc. So setting a greenhouse gas emission criteria on that procurement is a very clear signal that government can send to businesses and to pull through that innovation. The second piece that governments can do, and which I actually hear a lot, is how do governments align on international standards and definitions. Just one example on green or near zero emission steel. There are currently 20 definitions and initiatives which try to define what we mean when we're talking about green or near zero emission steel. And that doesn't really provide certainty to a steel maker that's looking to increase its steel production. Will I be able to export into these geographies? Will governments accept the criteria of green steel that I've been looking at? So I think that's something that can be done, and I know there's a lot of great work happening to align on those international standards and definitions. I think the last thing that the governments can do and regulators can do is provide guidance on things like eco-labeling and environmental product certificates as well. This can provide certainty for when companies are looking across their supply chains, deciding whether their suppliers are really climate leaders. They can look to government for guidance on what does it actually mean to be an SME, for example, or a supplier that is truly climate ambitious. So I think they're kind of the three key levers that I see, and particularly this year.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Nathan. See, rounds of applause. So I should take this opportunity to remind the audience, hopefully those of you who've been around at this conference for a little while now are familiar with asking questions through Slido. This is a session in which you can ask questions through Slido, so please get those questions in, and somewhere, I'm scanning the horizon, there's an iPad that might even have those questions pop up. I might walk and talk and go and find that. But I'm going to, in the meantime, I'm going to quickly come back across the panel, but ask for much briefer interjections. Nathan, just building what you said before, could you say something about how government can help to mobilize investment into emerging markets and developing economies, as well as just in the domestic space?
Yeah. So I think the role of emerging economies on climate, but also on global prosperity, cannot be underestimated. The emerging economies are going to be the growth engine of the world economy for the next 30 years, which is good for prosperity, but could be bad for global emissions if we don't take the right action, if governments and businesses don't take the right action to ensure that the carbon-intensive energy sources that emerging economies are currently on, things like coal and oil and gas, we need to shift those. We need to leapfrog from coal to clean across those emerging economies. There are a number of risks and kind of barriers to when a company wants to invest in emerging economies. The World Economic Forum actually is working exactly on this. One of the key risks that we see is exchange rates risks. So how do we de-risk and limit the exposure that a company in a certain country has in investing in emerging economies? There's some great blueprints, I would say. I wouldn't yet say success stories, but there's some great blueprints when it comes to blended finance mechanisms, particularly when it comes to coal to clean in emerging economies through the Just Energy Transition partnerships. I hope that really does mobilize the billions that we need to move these countries away. Also, one other thing that I'd just say in terms of UK leadership actually is, so a lot of the international finance that's come from the UK and other donor countries has been focused on energy transition, but actually we're seeing a lot more money, concessionary finance, a part of the envelope going to industry decarbonisation in emerging economies as well, which is, I think, is very important and something that we'd like to see more of.
Brilliant, thank you. So I am going to turn now to some of the questions that have been coming through from the audience. Thank you very much for those. So maybe if any of the other panelists would like to pick these up. So one question's around the valley of death, which has been mentioned a couple of times by different panelists. So, you know, this is creates real high risk perceptions for green technology projects. How can government and public financial tools help with that? Maybe Julia or David want to pick that up?
First, I define it as valley of deaths. It's not just one valley of death. So, I mean, not to be sober and sobering, but I think it's really important to sort of look at what stage. And if you're thinking about steel as an example, you know, there's some steel from electrolysis technologies that is sort of still very, very early stage. Whereas if you're thinking about hydrogen-based steel, then that's sort of ready to be already, there are already 3 plants that are started construction. So you don't have the same valley of death, right? One might be the earlier stage company would be around, well, I'm actually having challenges raising funds as a company or getting the funding that I need for my technology milestones. Whether if you're looking at green steel, for example, where it's already mature, you know, that to me is not the same challenge, and that's more one of a project financing. So I think there's certainly a role for governments and for public finance to play a role. I think focusing more on the latter, where you're looking at first commercial scale projects like green steel or sustainable aviation fuels, I think there's really a need. If you take sustainable aviation fuels as an example, and we've been working with the Green Finance Institute here in the UK on this particular challenge and opportunity. The UK has defined a 10% mandate for purchasing sustainable aviation fuels by 2030. That's much bigger from where I live, which is in Europe, in Paris, I should say, which only has that 6% mandate. Now, great, fantastic demand signal, but if you're still a producer of sustainable aviation fuel and not yet a producer, but you want to have that, that facility and that plant built, you still have a major gap, because that demand is for 2030. That demand isn't necessarily there. And then there's that premium that I talked about, 2, 3, 4 times more expensive. And then you add another sort of challenge, which is potentially feedstock. And then you add another sort of challenge around technologies and milestones and construction. Point being that I think there's certainly an importance between, there's a big difference between the mandate and then what type of support would you need to see from governments helping out, either in terms of revenues, but also in terms of de-risking when it comes to some of the CapEx related projects. So I think here, again, Department for Transport is thinking about these elements around what type of revenue support mechanism, how can that help overcome some of that risk when it comes to the premium. It's also starting to think about what type of CapEx support mechanism, but you need certainly both, at least for these first of a kind, because otherwise you actually won't see final investment decisions. One observation, and perhaps that I have, is the UK's really has a very sizable sort of grant element, and the UK Innovation Fund, Department for Transport, that's sizable grants. And then you also have UK Infrastructure Bank, fantastic sort of setup in terms of wanting to become very ambitious when it comes to clean, when it comes to the policy agenda. But you still have that valley of death when it comes to the type of capital that you need to be able to properly share the type of risks that different types of investors want to take, the technology risk, the price volatility risk. So I certainly think that there's a lot to be constructed, and keen to hear from Peter and from David on that as well.
Great, thank you. Well, yeah, we have time to squeeze in a couple of more questions, and I'm keeping them fairly brief. And so I'm going to come to David and to Peter. So David, a good one for you. What are effective ways to leverage green innovation as an instrument to assist levelling up? So for those who don't know that particular bit of jargon, that's the government's focus on creating economic growth all across different parts of the UK, and I suspect that's something the Carbon Trust has been quite involved in.
Super, yeah. I think building on that earlier comment around the diversity of industry, I think one of the fantastic things about industry is that we see it all around the country, and often we see clusters of activity in areas where there is a real priority around levelling up. And so, I think part of that challenge for not just governments, but philanthropic foundations, large companies in the space, is how do they see that pipeline of innovators that are coming through early and engage effectively with them with what they're comfortable doing at the stage that is meaningful for the innovator. So, perhaps just building on some of the comments that Julia made around the valleys of death, very much echo that feeling that there's multiple valleys for these innovators to get over. And I think historically the feeling has been, government will do the early stuff, business will do the later stuff, finance will come in when things are de-risked. And I think what we're starting to see now is an evolution towards an ecosystem where people are asking themselves, if we're really going to accelerate progress at the speed and scale that's needed, as Nathan was describing and Peter touched on earlier as well, then we need to see how do these different actors engage at sort of all stages and think about what they can do, part of which is about funding, but it's also about things like how do we provide access to test sites? What are the skills and expertise that we can provide? What are the connections or relationships that we can look to build? And so the way that, for example, a large company may engage early is different to a government. It may be making a site available and co-funding a demonstration that they want to see that meets their needs, knowing that government support is there to de-risk the innovative demonstration, and then thinking about, well, how do we get some of the the funders and others in to take that demonstration from a relevant customer operating environment to scale. And some of the really interesting things that we're seeing on the levelling up side are some of the clustering effects that you'll see around places like the Humber and other areas around the UK, where as we look at some of these system shifts, you're starting to see how waste heat from one process can power the innovations needed in another, and build, if you like, a new industrial revolution in some of the places that for a while have been left behind. And that's something that we're really excited about. And we think across the diversity of industry, there's huge scope around the country to pull innovations through where they're needed, drawing on the the relative contributions that that different stakeholder groups can make.
Great, thank you. And for Peter, we've talked about sort of push, we've talked about demand, but I think you maybe have some interesting thoughts on what we could also see impacting innovation from behaviour change. Would you like to expand on that a little bit more?
Well, I think there's a few sort of points about this. Behavior change starts from all of us. I think, yeah, at the moment there is this almost sentiment that if you want to be green, you want to be good, you have to be good in everything that you do. And actually, I think that's almost one of the biggest inhibitors I see in people actually trying to engage in doing something, because they feel if I try, I'm going to get knocked. Because if I'm trying to be sustainable, but I do something, I don't know, like I fly in a plane, I'm going to get knocked for it. But that's not practical. People aren't fundamentally perfect. And I think we as individuals need to say, actually, if I can incrementally do one thing better, that's better than what was done before. And I think we need to sort of translate that into everything that we do, be it across how we invest, how we interact as individuals. And I think that will have a big impact. You make one buying signal difference to a corporate, they're going to act on it. The ability to act more real time from corporates on information like that is important. So I think, we've got a big responsibility. I think a lot of people think, oh, it's just beyond us. But actually, we're probably the ones that can actually vote with our feet. And unfortunately, we're still in the vast minority, relatively. We need to get this as a mass movement for this to have any traction. But, I'm hopeful that we can, but we also need to give people consumer products that are more green and sustainable as well. You'll have seen the Steve Jobs quote, people aren't there to tell us what they need or what they want. We have to somewhat create that product. So I think demand side is going to make a big difference, but it's incumbent on all of us here to provide products that are sustainable. And that's, I think, ultimately when you can get that double coincidence of wants, where people want good, we've got some good products, you're then really going to make something good.
Great, thank you. So I think we're pretty much at time now, but I think in the 45 minutes we've had a good run through this topic. And just to sum up a little what some of our great panelists have said, we've talked about the need to show what is possible. We've talked about the need to learn from what's happened before, what's gone right and what's gone wrong. We've talked about the importance of defining what we want and what we need, and about creating the demand for that, including opportunities to create clusters, particularly in the UK, looking at the geographical context and the real geography of this country, and also putting that in the global context. And then a very helpful call to action at the end from Peter there. We've got to make a start, and you don't start by doing everything at once. You start with small steps and they grow to larger steps. So the challenge can seem extremely daunting. I didn't get to all the questions. One of the questions was about, isn't the real problem we're just going to have a civilizational collapse? Let's not fool ourselves, there are risks. But there are also opportunities to get this right, and I think it was a very inspiring panel today. I'd like to thank all our panelists for giving us some insight into what could be happening next.